The early evening air in Boston was crisp, the kind that hinted at an approaching autumn. Maya Whitman stood at the grand marble entrance of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, clutching a carefully wrapped gift in her hands. She had picked her outfit with thought. Simple, elegant, respectful. A navy blue dress paired with her father's vintage brooch. Something old for a new beginning. Her heart fluttered with a mix of nerves and hope. Today was Lila's wedding day, a celebration she had waited for as long as her sister had dreamed of it. Though their relationship had grown distant over the years, Maya believed her presence here would be a small step toward something better, maybe even a quiet reconciliation. But as she approached the check-in desk, a sleek table adorned with a floral arrangement of ivory roses and soft lighting, the warmth in her chest quickly turned cold. "Name, please?" asked the event coordinator, a woman named Taryn, whose clipboard was just as polished as her demeanor. Maya smiled. "Maya Whitman. I'm the bride's sister." Taryn's fingers paused, her expression flickered. A beat of silence passed, too long to be innocent. She scanned the list again, brows gently furrowed. "I'm sorry, I don't see your name here. Are you sure you RSVP'd?" Maya's polite smile stiffened. "Yes, but even if I hadn't, I'm family. I'm Lila's sister." Another glance at the clipboard. Another pause. "I understand. Let me just double-check with my supervisor." The music from inside the museum's courtyard, a string quartet playing something classical and light, floated through the doors, brushing against Maya like a cruel whisper. She adjusted her grip on the gift. A handmade quilt stitched with scenes from their childhood summers in Vermont had taken her weeks to finish. When Taryn returned, her tone lowered and her voice softened. "Miss Whitman, I'm really sorry. I was told not to admit you. It was a personal request made by Eleanor Whitman. I believe she's your mother?" The words struck like ice water. Maya blinked. "You must be mistaken," she said, though the truth was already settling in her gut like a stone. "I'm afraid not. I was given strict instructions that you weren't to attend under any circumstances." Maya didn't cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers and security guards and the soft glow of celebration just beyond the doorway. She steadied herself, straightening her posture. It wasn't the first time her mother had drawn a line between her and Lila, but this was final. For a long moment, she stood in silence. She could have argued. She could have demanded to see her sister, to cause a scene, to break through the glass doors and prove her right to exist in a family that had constantly diminished her. But she didn't. She glanced at the golden lights flickering through the museum's arched. Outside, the hum of traffic and laughter from a nearby cafe filled the air. She didn't look back. The weight of exclusion pressed against her chest, but there was no room for tears. Not here. Not now. She had spent a lifetime being erased, but something inside her shifted in that moment. If her family had chosen to forget her, then maybe it was time she stopped trying to belong. Maybe it was time to rewrite the narrative they had stolen from her. This wasn't the end, it was the spark of something new. Back in her small apartment in Cambridge, Maya placed her purse on the kitchen counter with robotic precision and stared blankly at the soft glow of the city outside her window. The distant hum of a passing train rattled the glass, but her mind was far from the present. Instead, it spiraled backward through time, to the fragile web of memories that made up her family's history. Even as a child, Maya had understood her place in the Whitman household, supporting Cass to the golden lead. Lila had always been radiant, confident, charming, a natural performer who flourished under their mother Eleanor's exacting standards. Ballet recitals, debate competitions, private tutors, Lila received it all. Maya, on the other hand, was the quiet one, praised for being low maintenance, but rarely seen for who she truly was. She learned early that attention from Eleanor came only when something needed fixing or when Lila needed saving. Maya was dependable, invisible, and expected to stay that way. When their father fell ill during Maya's senior year of college, Eleanor was too preoccupied with planning charity galas to care for him. Maya stepped in without hesitation, postponing her plans to pursue a master's in fine arts. She stayed by his bedside, spoon-fed him soup, drove him to chemo appointments, and held his hand through the worst of it. Leela visited when it was convenient, always apologizing with flowers and handwritten cards before returning to her rigorous pre-law schedule at Yale. Eleanor never once thanked Maya. Instead, she criticized her for wasting potential and throwing away her future on caregiving. Maya told herself it didn't matter, that love, unlike approval, didn't need to be earned. But as the years passed, the wounds deepened. She remembered the quiet Christmases when Lila was overseas on internships and Eleanor hosted lavish parties without inviting Maya. She remembered sending money from her modest teacher's salary to help Lila cover rent in New York, even skipping meals to make the payments. She remembered birthdays where her phone stayed silent, and most of all, she remembered the day their father died, how Eleanor cried at the funeral with immaculate makeup and perfectly chosen grief, while Maya stood in the back, unnoticed, clutching the eulogy she had written but never been asked to read. The funeral guests, friends of Eleanor's from the Beacon Hill Women's Circle, had barely acknowledged her. Maya had never been part of that world. Now, as she stared at her reflection in the window, a hollow ache settled in her chest. The wedding snub wasn't a one-time slight. It was the final confirmation of what she had always known deep down, that her mother had never seen her as a daughter worth celebrating. Eleanor had spent years shaping Layla into the image of perfection, and Maya had merely been the scaffolding holding it all together. But scaffolding could be removed once the structure stood tall. And now, she had been discarded, forgotten. But this time, something inside Maya refused to crumble. The story wasn't over. Not yet. Maya sat on the edge of her bed, still dressed in her navy blue dress, her shoes kicked off haphazardly by the door. The room was dim, lit only by a desk lamp casting a warm pool of light on her bookshelf. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen, scrolling through years of unanswered texts she had sent to Lila, birthday wishes, updates about their father's health, little messages of support during her bar exam. Some were marked read without replies. Others had clearly never even been delivered. She stared at one from 2 years ago. Thinking of you today. Hope you're okay. No response. It hadn't seemed strange at the time. Lila had always been busy, but now the silence felt suspicious, calculated even. The thread of doubt grew tighter around Maya's throat. What if her mother hadn't just ignored her all these years? What if she had actively erased her? She got up and paced the room, her bare feet pressing into the old hardwood floor. The more she thought about it, the more moments surfaced, like puzzle pieces she hadn't known were missing. Times when gifts she sent Lila were never acknowledged. When family gatherings happened without her knowledge. When her mother had said in passing, "It's better this way, Maya. You wouldn't fit in at events like these." At the time, Maya had brushed it off as yet another jab at her quiet, artistic lifestyle. But now, it felt darker, intentional. She wasn't just forgotten. She was filtered out. The realization hit her like a slow-moving wave. Maybe this wasn't just a lifetime of being overlooked. Maybe it was sabotage. She paused in front of a framed photo on the wall. Her and Lila as teenagers, sitting on the docks in Vermont, their arms wrapped around each other laughing. That bond, once so natural, had been twisted by years of Eleanor's favoritism and interference. But what if Lila hadn't pulled away on her own? What if she had been pushed? Maya turned back to her phone and opened her messages again, her thumb hovering over Lila's name. She wanted to call, to scream, to ask why. But something stopped her. If Lila knew and said nothing, that would be another wound Maya couldn't bear tonight. And if she didn't know, then maybe she deserved to. Either way, the answer wouldn't come from another unanswered text. It would come from the truth. And Maya knew now that the only way to find it was to dig. She exhaled. sat at her desk, and pulled open the drawer that held her father's old documents. If Eleanor wanted to erase her, Maya would begin by unearthing every piece of what had been taken, and this time, she wouldn't look away. Maya pulled out the old oak lockbox from the back of her desk drawer, its brass latch slightly rusted from age. It had belonged to her father, a modest, unassuming man who had worked as a public librarian for over 30 years. He had once told her, "Keep everything that matters in here. Paper doesn't forget like people do." Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, a few faded photos, and a manila folder marked in her father's handwriting, "For Maya. Personal." Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were the documents he had prepared before his passing: his will, some correspondence with his attorney, and copies of financial records that seemed, at the time, insignificant. But now they held weight. She sat at her desk and began reading, her teacher's eye scanning each page for detail. A life insurance policy stood out. Her father had designated a payout to her, nearly $150,000. It was meant to help her go back to school, open a studio, restart the life she had put on pause. But Maya had never received that money. Her heart began to thud in her chest as she checked the account number listed for the beneficiary deposit. It wasn't hers. The digits didn't match any bank she'd ever used. Her breath caught. She reached for her laptop and logged into her bank's oldest available statements. Nothing. Not a trace of any life insurance deposit. She dug deeper, cross-checking names, dates, and account details. The policy had been processed and paid within 4 months of her father's death. The payout had gone through, just not to her. Her pulse quickened. She emailed the insurance company's help desk, requesting verification of the transfer history, then followed up with a phone call. The customer service representative was polite but firm. Due to privacy laws, they could only confirm that the funds had been redirected to a signed, authorized recipient. Maya pressed. "Who signed off on the change?" The woman on the line hesitated, then said, "I can't tell you that over the phone, but I can confirm the name on the beneficiary update file was Eleanor Whitman." Maya's stomach turned. Her mother had forged, manipulated, or coerced her way into rerouting the only financial security Maya's father had left her. The betrayal was bigger than she imagined. This wasn't about being excluded from a wedding. This was theft. Deliberate and cold. The inheritance meant to help Maya heal and grow had instead been used, according to credit traces and online searches, for a down payment on Eleanor's penthouse in Beacon Hill, and as part of the education for Leela's time at Yale and Columbia Law. Every sacrifice Maya made, every dollar she scraped together to help Leela, had been unnecessary. Her mother had let her struggle while sitting on a stolen fortune. She leaned back in her chair, stunned into stillness. All these years she had thought her struggle was noble, necessary, that she had chosen this modest life out of loyalty, out of love. But now she realized she had never even been given a choice. Her own mother had decided that Maya's dreams, her future, her independence were less important than maintaining Eleanor's image of a perfect family. The bitterness rising in her throat threatened to spill over, but Maya forced herself to breathe. This was no longer about grief. It was about truth. With slow, deliberate movements, she organized the documents into a single folder labeled Proof. Then she opened a new spreadsheet on her laptop. If Eleanor thought she had buried this quietly, she was wrong. Maya was done being silent. The evidence was there, laid bare in paper and numbers, and with it, Maya had just found her weapon. Maya worked through the night, the glow of her laptop the only light in the room. The folder labeled Proof sat beside her, now growing thicker with every printed page. Her fingers tapped restlessly against the keyboard as she pulled bank records, emailed copies of insurance documents to a secure folder, and retrieved old correspondence from an email account she hadn't used in years. One that still contained messages from her mother, casually discussing financial matters with just enough arrogance to leave a trail. The more Maya dug, the clearer the picture became. Eleanor had orchestrated every detail with chilling precision, redirecting the insurance payout, disguising the transactions under the Whitman family trust, and using Maya's silence and distance as a convenient cover. She had counted on Maya being too modest, too tired, or too trusting to ever question it. Maya wasn't an accountant or a lawyer, but she was meticulous, a skill sharpened by years of grading art history essays and teaching overworked teenagers how to focus. She built a timeline, matching bank transfers with emails, flagging inconsistencies, documenting every time she had sent money to. By dawn, she had over 50 pages of documented evidence. She contacted a friend of a friend, a legal advisor who owed her a favor for tutoring his daughter through her senior art project. She didn't give details over the phone, only asked for help preparing a legal demand letter and reviewing the legitimacy of her findings. The advisor agreed, intrigued by her calm but unmistakably serious tone. For the first time in years, Maya felt something unfamiliar. Power. Not the kind that boasted or manipulated, but the quiet, steady certainty that she held the truth. And it was no longer just a secret whispered into the void. It was real, tangible. She had proof of Eleanor's betrayal, and she would no longer be the forgotten daughter hiding in the wings. She would no longer ask for permission to be seen. Maya didn't want to destroy her mother for sport, but she refused to let Eleanor walk away from this untouched. Her mother had played a long game, built on deception and status, but she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated the strength of the one daughter she thought would never fight back. 3 days later, Maya stood outside the towering doors of the Beacon Hill Women's Circle, her coat wrapped tightly around her, the collar pulled up against the chill. The club was a fortress of old money and exclusivity, a place Eleanor Whitman had treated like her second home for over a decade. Maya had only been inside once as a guest of her mother years ago, and she remembered feeling like an outsider among the pearls and silk scarves. But today was different. Today, Maya walked through the doors not as someone seeking approval, but as someone who held the truth. She had called Eleanor 2 days prior, her voice calm, composed. "I think it's time we talked," she had said. "There are some things we need to clear up." Her mother, ever the image of grace and control, had paused for only a breath before replying, "Of course, darling, let's meet at the club, Friday at noon," as if Maya were just another loose thread to neatly trim. Now, Maya waited at the reserved table near the window, her manila folder beside her latte, eyes fixed on the doorway. At exactly 12 o'clock, Eleanor arrived, perfectly punctual, perfectly composed. She wore a cream cashmere wrap, designer heels, and a smile that could disarm a diplomat. "Maya," she said with a tilt of her head, sliding into the seat across from her without a hint of tension. "I must say, this is unexpected." Maya returned the smile, just as measured. "It's long overdue." They exchanged pleasantries, empty, elegant. Eleanor commented on the renovations at the museum, the success of Lila's wedding, and how dreadful it was that Maya hadn't been able to attend. Maya let her talk, let her perform. And then, with deliberate care, she reached into her bag, pulled out the folder, and laid a single page on the table between them. Eleanor's voice faltered mid-sentence. Her eyes scanned the document, a copy of the life insurance beneficiary transfer, signed in her name. Maya said nothing. She didn't need to. The proof spoke louder than any accusation. Eleanor's fingers stiffened around her teacup. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice cool but no longer steady. "You stole from me," Maya said quietly, her voice unwavering. "You rewrote our family's story and cast me out of it. But now, I have the truth, and I'm giving you one opportunity to make it right." Eleanor's laugh was soft, brittle, Maya, please. You've always been so dramatic. That money was redirected for practical reasons. You weren't in a position to— No, Maya cut in. You weren't in a position to decide what I deserved. That money was mine. Dad wanted me to have it, and you made sure I never saw a cent. The older woman leaned back, the faintest hint of panic flashing in her eyes. You don't want to do this, she warned. Maya reached into her folder again and slid across a second paper. A legal demand letter, neatly typed, outlining the restitution required and the timeline. You have two choices, she said. Return what you stole, or I take this public. To the board members you lunch with, to the press that adores your charity work, to the guests you so carefully curate at your events. The silence between them was razor sharp. Eleanor said nothing, her smile long gone, and Maya knew, in that moment, the balance of power had finally shifted. Her mother wasn't untouchable. Not anymore. Maya rose slowly from her seat, collected her folder, and looked her mother in the eye one last time. This isn't revenge, she said softly. This is justice. Then she walked away, leaving Eleanor alone at the table, her flawless image cracking like porcelain under pressure. It started with a text. 2 days after their meeting at the Beacon Hill Women's Circle, Maya's phone buzzed just as she stepped out of her afternoon class. A single message from Lila. Mom's acting weird. Keeps asking if I've spoken to you. What's going on? Maya stared at the screen, heart thudding. She had expected this. Part of her had even rehearsed the moment. Still, she hesitated before replying. She typed and deleted 3 different versions before finally sending just 2 words. Ask her. Lila didn't reply right away, but Maya could imagine the look on her face. Confused, maybe even irritated, but curious. That was enough. Eleanor had always relied on secrets, on carefully crafted narratives that told everyone exactly what to think. Now that control was slipping, and Maya didn't need to force anything. The truth would take root on its own. 3 days later, there was a knock on Maya's apartment door. She opened it to find Lila standing there, still in work clothes, her coat hastily thrown on, hair pulled back in a rushed bun. In her hands were several printed statements. Photocopies Maya had shared with her lawyer, now clearly passed down the chain. Tell me she's lying, Lila said, her voice already breaking. Tell me Mom didn't actually do this. Maya stepped aside, letting her in without a word. Lila stood in the center of the room, her eyes darting between the papers and Maya's face. She said you didn't want to be part of the wedding, that you cut yourself off years ago, that you weren't interested in us anymore. Her voice cracked on the last words. She said you didn't care. Maya didn't respond right away. Instead, she walked to the kitchen, poured 2 cups of coffee and slid one across the counter. Then she looked her sister in the eye. I never stopped caring, she said. But I was pushed out. She made sure of it. Lila sat down slowly, the weight of realization anchoring her in place. She told me you wanted distance, that you never responded to my messages. Maya shook her head. I texted you for years, sent gifts, money, encouragement. She intercepted everything. Silence stretched between them, long, heavy, real. Lila's eyes filled with tears. She made me believe you left us. She needed you to believe that, Maya said gently, because if you questioned her, the entire story would collapse. Layla's hands tightened around the papers. I believe you, she whispered. And with those 3 words, something in Maya, something long bruised and buried, began to heal. Eleanor hadn't just stolen money. She had stolen the bond between sisters, rewritten a shared history into a single, lonely narrative. But now the truth was surfacing, and Lila had chosen to see it. In that moment, Maya didn't need victory. She had something better, the beginning of something real. It didn't take long for the whispers to begin. At first they were subtle. Side glances at luncheons, brief pauses in conversation when Eleanor entered the room. But in a place like the Beacon Hill Women's Circle, subtlety was how reputations lived and died. Eleanor had built her life on carefully managed optics: the grieving widow, the elegant matriarch, the devoted philanthropist. She wore perfection like a second skin, and for years no one had dared to look too closely beneath it, until now. Word of Maya's legal demand hadn't gone public in any official sense, but these kinds of truths never stayed private for long. Someone from the club must have overheard their confrontation. Someone else had likely seen Eleanor's shaken expression afterward. Whatever the source, the details began to leak. An inheritance misdirected, a daughter erased, a cover-up too personal and calculated to ignore. People talked. They always did. Suddenly, Eleanor's standing invitations were rescinded. The committee she chaired restructured without her. Her usual table at the club was mysteriously unavailable. Even her longtime friends began avoiding her calls, too wary to be associated with scandal. Eleanor tried to save face. She doubled down on charity appearances, hosted impromptu dinners, smiled harder, but the cracks were visible now, and in a social circle obsessed with image, cracks were fatal. What hurt her most wasn't the financial threat, it was the loss of control. For a woman like Eleanor, reputation was currency, and now hers was bankrupt. She called Maya twice, once from a blocked number, once under the guise of clearing the air. Maya let them both go to voicemail. Meanwhile, Lila stopped defending her. She no longer responded to their mother's texts with the same urgency, no longer attended weekly brunches. Eleanor's greatest fear had come to pass, not public shame, but the realization that her perfect daughter had begun to see her clearly. In the end, Eleanor wasn't exiled. She was ignored. Her world didn't explode. It evaporated, slowly, quietly, and completely. For the first time in years, Maya felt the stillness of possibility. With the inheritance finally restored, transferred to her account after Eleanor's reluctant settlement, she no longer felt tethered to the life she had built from sacrifice. She gave her school notice and left her job with grace, grateful for the years of service, but ready to move on from the underfunded classrooms and constant burnout. Within weeks, she accepted a new role at a private art conservatory in the South End. The position wasn't just better paid, it valued her creativity, her experience, and her quiet strength. For the first time, she wasn't the one holding others up. She was being seen. She moved into a new apartment near the Charles River, a sunlit space filled with old wood floors, warm light, and wide windows. There she unpacked pieces of herself long buried. Her watercolors, the unfinished canvases, the travel books she used to pore over as a student. She booked a trip to Florence, a dream destination she had always told herself was too indulgent, too far. But not anymore. Not now. She was no longer living in the shadow of obligation. She was choosing joy, one small act at a time. Her days became slower, intentional. She walked to local cafes in the morning, took long bike rides along the esplanade, spent afternoons painting or curled up with books that had nothing to do with work, and slowly, the tightness in her chest, the feeling of never being enough, began to fade. She didn't miss the approval she had once chased. She didn't need it. She had carved out a new space in the world, one that belonged wholly to her. Of course, the scars remained. She still had moments of doubt, of questioning whether she had waited too long to reclaim her life, but then she'd look around, at the soft light pouring through her kitchen window, at the emails from her new students brimming with gratitude, at the framed painting of the Vermont docks she had finally finished, and she knew it wasn't too late. It was exactly the right time. Maya hadn't set out to destroy Eleanor. She had only wanted to be free. And now, at last she was. She had her name back, her voice back, her future back. And with each new day, she was learning that peace didn't come from being seen by others. It came from finally seeing herself. Rebuilding her relationship with Leela didn't happen all at once. It began in small, cautious gestures. A forwarded article, a shared laugh over an old inside joke, a text that read simply, "Thinking of you today." There was a fragility to it at first, like walking across thin ice, both of them unsure how deep the cracks ran, but there was also honesty now, and that made all the difference. They met for coffee one rainy Saturday at a quiet cafe near Harvard Square. No pretenses, no expectations, just two sisters trying to navigate the damage left behind. Lila apologized more than once. She cried, not out of guilt, but out of grief for everything she hadn't seen. "I should have asked more questions," she said, voice trembling. "I should have wondered why you drifted." Maya shook her head. "You believed what you were told. So did I." For a long time. In that conversation, something unspoken passed between them. A letting go, not of the past, but of the shame that had clung to it. They weren't adversaries anymore. They were survivors of the same story, just on opposite sides of it. Over time, their connection deepened. They took walks along the river, traded weekend book recommendations, even cooked dinner together like they used to in their father's kitchen. Maya no longer felt like the forgotten sister, and Lila no longer carried the weight of being the favored one. They didn't try to rewrite history, but they began together to write a new chapter. One built on truth, respect, and the kind of love that grows stronger when it's no longer being controlled. It happened on a brisk October morning, the kind where the sky is clear and the city hums softly beneath the weight of changing leaves. Maya had just left a small gallery exhibit in Back Bay, her bag full of pamphlets and the lingering warmth of espresso in her hand, when she spotted her. Eleanor sat alone at an outdoor cafe table, dressed in her usual muted elegance. Camel coat, pearl earrings, sunglasses that couldn't quite hide the emptiness in her eyes. For a moment, they simply stared at one another, both motionless in the swirl of passers-by. Maya didn't feel anger, not anymore. Not pity either. Just a quiet, distant understanding. The kind that comes when you've finally outgrown the need for someone's approval. Eleanor lifted her teacup in acknowledgement, offering a faint, hollow smile, the kind she used when words might fracture the illusion. Maya returned the gesture with a subtle nod. She didn't stop. She didn't wave. She just kept walking, each step pulling her further away from the woman who had once tried to erase her. And in that moment, Maya understood what freedom really looked like. It wasn't confrontation or revenge. It was indifference. It was the power to move forward without needing closure from someone who would never give it. Eleanor hadn't changed, she probably never would, but Maya had. She had built a life that was hers, surrounded by people who saw her, chose her, loved her for who she was, not who she was supposed to be. She didn't look back. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. That chapter had ended long ago, and in her silence, in her steps, in the soft wind that carried her forward, Maya finally let her mother go. For good. Maya often found herself reflecting during quiet moments, while rinsing paintbrushes in her studio sink, while watching the sunset fade behind the rooftops, or while sitting by the river with a sketchpad in her lap. The chaos had passed, but its echoes remained. Not sharp, not painful, just reminders of how far she had come. She thought often about betrayal, how sometimes it arrives with a scream, but more often, it comes wrapped in silence, in the things never said, in the roles forced upon you, in the empty chair at a table where you should have had a place. She had lived a lifetime believing she wasn't enough because someone else needed her to believe it. But the truth? The truth had always been there, waiting, and when she finally chose to uncover it, to face it head-on, everything changed. Not because the past was undone, but because she had stopped letting it define her. She realized healing didn't mean pretending it hadn't happened. It meant choosing to live in spite of it, to build something better not out of vengeance, but out of purpose. Leela was healing too. Their bond wasn't perfect, but it was real now. Free of competition, of comparison, of control. They had learned to speak honestly, to support each other, and to acknowledge the weight of everything they'd survived. Maya knew there would be more hard days ahead. Grief didn't vanish, but it no longer ruled her. She often thought back to the wedding day, how it had felt like a door slamming shut in her face. But in hindsight, it had been something else entirely. A beginning. The moment she stopped shrinking. The moment she chose to take up space. Maya didn't win by destroying Eleanor's legacy. She won by reclaiming her own. By becoming the author of her story, not the footnote. And in doing so, she discovered a quiet truth that had always been hers to keep. The best revenge isn't fire or fury. It's freedom. It's peace. It's living a life they can't touch. The story of Maya Whitman teaches a powerful lesson about self-worth, boundaries, and the quiet strength of reclaiming your voice. For years, Maya allowed herself to be cast aside, believing that love had to be earned through sacrifice and silence. But when faced with undeniable betrayal, she didn't seek revenge in anger. She sought justice with clarity. The lesson lies not in the exposure of Eleanor's lies, but in Maya's transformation. She learned that true freedom doesn't come from being accepted by others, but from choosing yourself, your peace, your truth, your future. She broke the cycle of manipulation, not by mirroring it, but by refusing to be controlled by it any longer. Through courage and self-respect, Maya turned pain into power and loss into liberation. The story reminds us that betrayal, no matter how deep, does not define our worth. What matters is what we do after, whether we stay erased or write ourselves back into the narrative. Maya chose to live boldly, with intention and on her own terms, and in doing so, she didn't just reclaim her inheritance, she reclaimed her life. The best kind of revenge isn't destruction. It's becoming untouchable in your truth.